Hey guys, how's it going? This is Waj from the MW Technology channel on YouTube and on instafuse.com, and in this video we're doing a direct comparison between the iPhone 5C and the iPhone 5S. Now, from the surface level of things, you'll notice that there's a lot of similarities and some minor differences between these two phones. Obviously, the 5C is really designed to be more of an entry-level smartphone for many people that might be getting the iPhone for the first time. But let's take a look at some of the major differences between these two and see which one is right for you. Now, the first thing that we're going to take a look at is the overall design and options of the 5C versus the 5S. In terms of colors, the 5C comes in pink, yellow, blue, green, and in white. The 5S, which is a little bit more of a premium product, actually comes with less variety. It comes in gold, silver, or in space gray. Now, when you pick up either of these devices and start comparing them, you'll notice that one of the big things that you notice is the overall feel of the devices. Now, the 5C is kind of the first iPhone of its kind. It's an entry-level iPhone, and it's designed for maybe first smartphone users who want to get into the iPhone and don't want to pay the extra price, and basically Apple's trying to give you more options. Therefore, being $100 cheaper than the iPhone 5S, it's made out of polycarbonate plastic. Now, even though it's plastic, it's still very durable and built solid, much in the vein of many other Apple products that are plastic, like the old iPods and things like that. Now, the 5S is made out of high quality aluminum, much in the same vein as the older iPhone 5, and in terms of the overall footprint, you'll notice that the 5S is just a little tiny bit bigger. It's about 124.4 millimeters in its height and about 59.2 millimeters in its width. Now, the 5S is about 123.8 millimeters in its height and about 58.6 millimeters in its width. And in terms of the thickness, the 5C is thicker at 8.97 millimeters and the 5S is 7.6 millimeters, much like the older iPhone 5. Now, interestingly, even though the 5C is made out of polycarbonate plastics, it actually is a little bit heavier than the 5S, measuring about 132 grams versus the 5S measuring about 112 grams. Now, when we start peeking at the design cues of both these phones, you'll notice that the 5C has a curved back screen. The plastic feels really premium, and I love the way this phone feels in my hand. I think it's a little bit more comfortable than actually even the 5S, which is a machined piece of aluminum that feels extremely well made, but it has sharp corners, although not sharp that you can cut yourself on it, but it certainly hasn't got that smooth, rounded feel of the 5C. Now, one of the big additions of the 5S and one of the tentpole differences between these two phones is the addition of the fingerprint sensor on the home button on the 5S, which should add a level of convenience and security on the 5S. So basically, you can scan your fingerprint to unlock the phone, you can scan your fingers to buy and download different applications in the App Store, and it basically essentially is integrated in the iOS to act as your password. Now, I'm pretty excited to see what Apple's and other third-party developers will do with this fingerprint sensor. A lot of people are saying that this is going to be a really big revolutionary thing to the smartphone segment. Now, obviously, in terms of security itself, there are some issues with fingerprint scanners. It's important to note that somebody can replicate your fingerprint and gain access to your phone quite easily if they know what they're doing. And in terms of the security issue itself, in terms of Apple gaining access to your fingerprint signature, Apple has claimed that the fingerprint scanner will not send that distinct information to the iCloud servers, or it should be just within the phone itself. But if you are worried about security, just know that the NSA and government organizations probably already have your fingerprint scanned at some point. So in terms of security, privacy is really something that you could never have fully control over, especially in these days. Now, despite the fact that Big Brother may have access to your fingerprint signature on the 5S, the displays themselves on these two devices devices are pretty much identical. They're both 4-inch in terms of the physical size. They both have the same 1136 by 640 resolution, same 326 ppi count. And in terms of the overall look, and again, the overall image quality when you're looking at the screen in real life, watching videos and photos and browsing through web pages, I think both screens are fantastic. I think the iPhone screen is absolutely tremendous. Now, many of us hope that the 5S would have a larger screen than 4-inch, but you can understand why Apple is still keeping that 4-inch size. It's very pocketable for most people. Most people perhaps don't want a large touchscreen smartphone, and they certainly don't like the big phablets and the huge smartphones that you find on the Android platform. So it's definitely more convenient to have that kind of smaller size. But one of the cool things about Apple segmenting their iPhone product line is the fact that maybe next year and the years to come, we're going to see more different varieties in the iPhone category. You're going to have potentially different screen sizes for different users. So that's something certainly to look forward to. Now, under the hood of the 5C and the 5S, you'll find some similarities and some differences. One of the big differences is on the 5C, we're sticking with the A6 processor that we found on the iPhone 5, but now the 5S has a new Apple A5 processor, which is actually using a 64-bit architecture, which is really going to push the envelope in terms of what you can do on the iPhone platform. It is a dual-core processor, much like the A6, but clocked in about 1.7 gigahertz. But the big thing about this new iPhone 5S is that it has a secondary processor, which is the M7 motion processor, which is really designed for processing gyroscope, accelerometers, and compass calculations. So fitness apps that monitor your walking speed, how far you've traveled, and how many calories you've burned throughout the day will be kind of using this motion processor to its full benefit and relieving the main A7 chip of some of its duties, thereby increasing battery life and efficiency. And we should find some interesting new applications that might take advantage of this M7 processor to do other cool things. Now, in terms of the system memory, both have 1 gig of RAM. Unfortunately, we would like to see more RAM on the new Apple iPhone 5S, considering it has a new 64-bit architecture. Moving on to some of the network specifications of the two devices, they both have a lot of different compatibilities being used across pretty much any network out there in the world, and they have full LTE support at up to 100 megabits per second downlink if you can have that kind of strong connection, of course. And they're both continuing to use the nano SIM form factor that you saw in previous iPhones. Now, the similarities continue when we take a look at the connectivity issues, which are virtually identical. They're both using 4.0 Bluetooth, and with the exact same Wi-Fi system. There's no real upgrade in either end, and they both are using, of course, that Lightning connection, which is just awesome. Now, those are, of course, some of the raw specifications of the 5C versus the 5S. When you take a look at real-life comparison tests in terms of opening up different applications, website loading, and doing some benchmarks, you'll notice, again, even though that there is a little bit of difference in terms of the processor, the overall experience is minorly improved on the 5S. You're not going to notice a huge difference between these two smartphones because the iOS 7 and just generally the platform is so optimized for the hardware. They just both run so smoothly and so fluidly in pretty much any different application and loading different websites up. Of course, you'll see a minor improvement in terms of speed and load times on the 5S, but it's not going to be a huge significant difference. Now, when we take a look at the Geekbench 3 benchmarking scores on both these two devices, you'll notice a pretty significant difference, even though the A7 and A6 in terms of the surface level may not seem to be that much more powerful. But when we take a look at this test, you'll notice that the iPhone 5S is a lot faster in completing the benchmark on Geekbench 3. And when we add up the results, you'll notice the single core and multi-core test scores are way higher, sometimes 2 to 3 times better performance than what you would find on the 5C. And the 5C is essentially the previous generation iPhone 5 in this kind of colorful body. So this is really last generation's technology versus current generation technology. And this is a good reflection of what you're getting in terms of some of the speed and hardware differences between the two smartphones. Now, before we move on, I just want to mention that both of these two devices are running the exact same iOS platform. They're both using iOS 7, which is really, I think, a great incremental upgrade of the iOS operating system. Now, obviously, the iOS 7 has some criticisms, but I think they're really doing a good job in terms of adding more convenient controls rather than going through the menu and changing some of your Wi-Fi settings and Bluetooth and battery options and screen brightness and things like that. So it's definitely more efficient and more powerful, in fact, with those new minor improvements. They shouldn't go to the route of what Android does because you might lose some of the key followers which love the seamless and oversimplified iPhone experience. And probably one of the most important aspects of why iOS 7 is the way that it is that Apple doesn't want to lose that credibility that iOS is probably the most simplest, easy to use computing interface ever made. Now let's talk about some of the cameras in the 5C versus the 5S. We'll start with the front-facing cameras on both these two devices. Now the 5C and the 5S virtually have the exact same front-facing camera. They're both 1.2 megapixel stills cameras that can do 720p at 30 frames per second. And if we take a look at the side-by-side comparison, there's not a huge difference between them. Now, since we're trying to find some differences between the cameras, we really have to move to the rear-facing cameras to notice any difference. Looking at the lenses, they both have a sapphire crystal lens covering, but the maximum aperture is a little bit more on the 5S. It goes up to f2.2, which should be a little bit better in low light compared to the 5C's f2.4. Now, another big difference is the actual sensors of these two cameras. The 5S now has a true 3rd-inch sensor, which is just a tiny bit bigger than the 3.2-inch sensor that's on the 5C. In terms of the pixel size, each pixel on the 5S is about 1.5 micrometers. On the 5C, it's about 1.4 micrometers. And when you're taking a look at the video functionality, you'll notice that both can do 1080p at 30 frames per second, but the 5C can do 720p at 120 frames per second slow motion. In terms of video stabilization, we also have a new advanced video stabilization mode on the 5S. So now let's go ahead and test out the image quality of the rear-facing camera and see if these specifications add up to any differences. Now what you're looking at is the same scene shot on both of the different cameras on the 5C and on the 5S. We both have the same exact lighting scheme and everything, and the settings are as close as possible, and we're looking at the stills functionality right now, and if you look at the images themselves, they look very, very similar. On the 5S, you do notice in terms a little bit of color differences, but it really isn't that much of a difference. Now when shooting more dimly lit situations, more low light scenarios, you'll notice that the 5S does a little bit better job in terms of rendering the image in a more poorly lit situations. Because it has a slightly larger sensor and a bigger maximum aperture, it's gonna let in more light, therefore being just a tiny bit better in low light scenarios, which means that you're gonna find a better exposed image with less overall noise than the 5C. Now looking at the 30 frames per second at 1080p, you'll notice that both cameras again do a very similar job in rendering their video footage. I think some of the characteristics of the 5S stills is carrying forward to the video of being just a little bit better in terms of color rendition. There's not going to be a difference in terms of sharpness or resolution since they're really the same, but when we take a look at a little more dimly lit situations, again you'll find that the 5S is a tiny bit better in rendering rendering low light scenes a little bit more accurately because again of its benefits of having the larger sensor and the better lens. Now lastly, one of the big things about the cameras on the 5S that is kind of new for really any smartphone is the addition to record 720p at 120 frames per second, which is going to allow you to do some pretty intense slow motion action. It's going to allow you to slow the footage down considerably from its normal playback, and this is going to open up a whole new category of seeing people fall down at super slow motion. Now the last thing that we'll talk about is the battery performance on both of the smartphones. Thankfully the iPhone 5S and 5C have exactly the same battery performance, although their battery capacity is a little bit different from each other. The 5C has a 1510 milliamp hour battery and the 5S has a 1570 milliamp hour battery, but thankfully both of them can do 10 hours of 3G talk time and about 250 hours of standby time. And with all that stuff done, that really concludes my comparison of the iPhone 5C versus the 5S. I would really be curious in terms of what you guys think of this video, whether you like one smartphone over the other. Do you think they're overall that different? I think they're very similar smartphones. There's minor differences here and there, and that's why you only have a minor price difference. And overall, either phone is great. If you have any specific preferences, again, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. And if you have any specific question about anything I talked about in this video, please make sure to leave that in a comment down below. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you can, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a whole bunch of different comparisons coming out with these new smartphones. We're going to take a look at the last generation iPhone 5 and test it against the 5S and the 5C separately and see whether you're wanting to upgrade if you have a 5S already, or maybe see if you're wanting to get any new iPhone, whether you think the 5S or the 5C is worth it compared to a used original iPhone 5. But other than that, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you later. Take care.